Okay, everyone, thank you very much for coming together to join in the experience of Torah, which is not just what we're going to be reading out of a book, Torah is also what we're going to be sharing with one another, our own thoughts, our own reflections, the presence that we share with one another, and our commitment to one another as a community based in Torah, seeking to share our lives with one another, seeking to make the world an ever better place, and to be guided by what we encounter in Torah. And we will be adding to Torah through our own insights, wisdoms, and experiences. So I'd like to invite everyone at this point to unmute, and then together we can recite our blessing. And then I will invite you to remute, and then we'll have an opportunity to take turns reading from this week's Torah portion. So again, I invite you to unmute, and together we can recite our blessing. Baruch Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher nitanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu so k'divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for this opportunity of sharing words, deeds, and lives of Torah. So we are going to be reading Parshat Lecha, which begins in the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verse 1. So again, I invite you at this point to mute. I'll read a few verses, and then I'll invite others to read some verses. Then I'll share a bit of focused study with you, and then invite you to share your own responses and thoughts and reflections about our
verse again, Rabbi? What verse?
So we're beginning in chapter 12, book of Genesis, verse 1.
Okay.
Let me share with you the opening verses. Adonai said to Abram, "Go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you, and all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you." Abram went forth as Adonai had commanded him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and all the wealth that they had amassed, and all the persons that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. When they arrived in the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem at the terebinth of Moreh. The Canaanites were then in the land. We're now on verse 7. Judith, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 7?
The Eternal now appeared to Abram and said, "I am giving this land to your descendants." Abraham then built an altar there to the Eternal who appeared to him. From there, he moved on to the hill country east of Bethel. He pitched his tent between Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built another altar to the Eternal and called upon the name of the Eternal. And then Abram continued his journey toward the Negev.
Thank you, Judith. And Margot, would you like to read beginning at verse 10?
There was famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. And he was about to enter Egypt. He said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. If the Egyptians see you and think she is his wife, they will kill me and let you live. Please say that you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may remain alive thanks to you. When Abraham entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw how very beautiful the woman was, Pharaoh's courtiers saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And because of her, it went well with Abram. He acquired sheep, oxen, asses, male and female slaves, she-asses, and camels. Should I go on?
Let me invite Joan, if you'd like to pick up at verse 17. Thank you, Mark.
But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his household with mighty plagues on account of Sarai, the wife of Abram. Pharaoh sent for Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? So I took her as my wife. Now here is your wife. Take her and be gone." And Pharaoh put men in charge of him, and they set him off with his wife and all that he possessed.
Thank you, Joan. Mark, would you like to read beginning at the start of chapter 13?
I'd be happy to. From Egypt, Abram went up into the Negev with his wife and all that he possessed, together with Lot. Now, Abram was very rich in cattle, silver, and gold, and he proceeded by stages from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been formerly, between Bethel and Ai, the site of the altar that he had built there at first. And there Abram invoked the Adonai by name. Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support them staying together. For their possessions were so great that they could not remain together. And there was quarreling between the herdsmen of Abram's cattle and those of Lot's cattle. Canaanites and the Perizzites were then dwelling in the land. Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, between my herdsmen and yours, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Let us separate. If you go north, I'll go south, and if you go south, I'll go north." Lot looked about him and saw how well watered was the whole plain of the Jordan, all of it. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, all the way to Zoar, like the garden of Adonai, like the land of Egypt. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they parted from each other. Abram remained in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the plain, pitching his tents near Sodom. Now, the inhabitants of Sodom were very wicked sinners against the Lord.
Thank you, Mark. And Richard, would you like to begin reading at verse 14?
Yes, thank you. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, "Raise your eyes and look out from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. For I give all the land that you see to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count of the dust of the earth, then your offspring too can be counted. Up, walk about the land, through its length and its breadth, for I give it to you." And Abram moved his tent and came to dwell in the terebinths of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and he built an altar there to the Lord.
Thank you, Richard. And Steve, would you like to begin reading at the first verse of chapter 14?
Yes, thanks. In the time of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Uriah, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, these four waged war against Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. These all joined forces in the valley of Siddim, now the Dead Sea. For 12 years they had been subject to Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. The 14th year, Chedorlaomer and his allied kings came and subdued the Rephaim and his allied, in Ashtaroth, Kanaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Amim and Shabah Kiriataim, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir, as far as Isle Paran by the edge of the wilderness. They then returned, coming to Ein Mishpat, that is Kadesh, where they subdued the whole country of Amalek and the Amorites who dwell in Hazaan Tamar. The king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and arrayed themselves in battle formation against the enemy in the valley of Siddim, against Kedar-Laomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5.
Very good, Steve. Thank you so much. And Martine, would you like to begin reading at verse 10? And you'll have to unmute yourself. Thank you, Martine.
Oh, I just muted myself again. Now the valley of Siddim was studded with tar pits, and when the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some tumbled into them, and the rest fled to the hills. So they took all the possessions of the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and their food, and they went off. And as they went off, they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, with his possessions. He was a resident of Sodom. A fugitive then came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oak trees of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and Aner, who were allied to Abram by treaty. Hearing that his kinsmen had been taken captive, Abram mustered his retainers, born into his household, 318 of them, going in pursuit as far as Dan. At night, he deployed himself and his forces against them and defeated them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. He then brought back all the possessions, his nephew Lot too, and all of his possessions. He restored the women too, and the other people. The king of Sodom came out to meet him after his return to the valley of Sheva, that is the king's valley, from fighting Kedar-Laomer and his allied kings. Now, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High and blessed him, saying, "Blessed be Avram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed is God Most High, who has given your foes into your hands." Then he, Avram, gave him a tenth of everything.
Thank you very much. We're now at verse 21. Gary, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 21 of chapter 14? And if you do want to, you'll need to unmute.
Rabbi, I left all my books on the school bus.
Okay, that's very good. Thank you. Thanks,
Again.
Gary. Keep chasing that school bus.
If you invite me back next week, I'll read a double portion.
Terrific, Gary. Dave, would you like to read beginning at verse 21?
Then the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons and take the possessions for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I swear to the Lord God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, I will not take so much as a thread or a sandal strap of what is yours. You shall not say, 'It is I who made Abram rich.' For me, nothing but what my servants has used up. As for the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, Mamre, let them take their share." Sometime later, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. He said, "Fear not, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great." But Abram said, "O Lord God, what can you give me, seeing that I shall die childless, and the one in charge of my household is Namesek Eliezer?" Abram said further, "Since you have granted me no offspring, my steward will be my heir." The word of the Lord came to him in reply, "That one shall not be your heir. None but your very own issue shall be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And he added, "So shall your offspring be." And then he put his trust in the Lord. He reckoned it to his merit.
Thank you, Dave. And Susan and David, would you like to do some reading beginning at verse 7?
And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give this land to inherit. And he said, O my master, how shall I know that I shall inherit it? And he said to him, take me a 3-year-old heifer and a 13-year-old she-goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. And he took all of these and clove them through the middle, and each set his part opposite the other, but the birds he did not cleave. And carrion birds came down on the carcasses, and Abram drove them off. And as the sun was about to set, a deep slumber fell upon Abram, and now a great dark dread came falling upon him. Go ahead.
God said to Abram, know now that your descendants shall be strangers in a land not theirs. They shall be enslaved and afflicted for 400 years. But then I will bring judgment upon the nation they are serving. After that, they shall go out with many possessions. And you shall go to your ancestors in peace. You shall be buried in good old age. The 4th generation shall return here, for not until then shall the iniquity of the Amorites be repaid. Keep going.
Yes, please.
Now, when the sun had set and it was dark, lo, a smoking oven and a fiery torch were what passed between those pieces. On that day, Hashem made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants, I have given this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the lands of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites.
Thank you both. Wayne, would you like to begin reading at the start of chapter 16?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an Egyptian handmaid whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, behold now, the Eternal hath restrained me from bearing. Come, I pray, unto my handmaid. Perhaps I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Adam's wife, took Hagar, her handmaid, the Egyptian, after Abram had abode 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband, Abram, to be his wife. And he came unto Hagar, and she became pregnant. And when she saw that she was pregnant, her mistress was slightened in her eyes. And Sarai said unto Abram, my wrong is through thee. I have given my handmaid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she was pregnant, I was slighted by her in her eyes. May the Eternal judge between me and thee. But Abram said unto Sarai, behold, thy handmaid is in thy hand. Do to her as it seemeth good in thine eyes. And Sarai afflicted her, and she fled in her face.
Thank you, Wayne. And then Barbara, would you like to begin verse 7? Would you like to read a little bit?
An angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the road to Shur, and said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I am running away from my mistress Sarai. And the angel of the Lord said to her, go back to your mistress and submit to her harsh treatment. And the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly increase your offspring, and they shall be too many to count. The angel of the Lord said to her further, behold, you are with child, and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael. For the Lord has paid heed to your suffering. He shall be a wild ass of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. He shall dwell alongside of all of his kinsmen. And she called the Lord who spoke to her, You are El Roi, by which she meant, Have I not gone on seeing that, pardon me, have I not gone on seeing after he saw me? Therefore, the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar bore a son to Abram, and Abram gave the son that Hagar bore him the name Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram.
Thank you, Barbara. And Tom and Jackie, would you like to read beginning at chapter 17?
Go ahead.
When Abram was 99 years old, the Eternal appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. Walk along before me and be pure of heart, and I will set a covenant between us and multiply you exceedingly. Abram fell on his face. God spoke with him, saying, As for me, here is my covenant with you. You shall be the father of a multitude of peoples. No longer are you to be called Abram. Your name is to be Abraham, for I am making you the father of a multitude of nations. I am making you exceedingly fruitful and turning you into nations. Kings shall come forth from you. I will establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you for all their generations, an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your descendants after you. I will give you and your descendants after you the land where you have sojourned, the whole land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God.
God then said to Abraham, As for you, observe my covenant, you and your descendants after you, all your generations. This is my covenant that you and your descendants after you observe. Let every male among you be circumcised. When the flesh of your foreskin has been circumcised, it shall be a sign of the covenant between us. And in all your generations, let every 8-day-old boy among you be circumcised, whether it be a homeborn slave or brought to you from foreigners, not of your own descent. Let your home-owned slave and the one by you be circumcised, so that my covenant may be in your flesh as an everlasting covenant. An uncircumcised male who is not circumcised, the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken the covenant.
Thank you, Tom. And let me see, Jay, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 15?
And God said to Abraham, As for your wife Sarai, you shall not call her Sarai, but her name shall be Sarah. I will bless her indeed. I will give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she shall give rise to nations. Rulers of peoples shall issue from her. Abraham threw himself on his face and laughed, as he said to himself, Can a child be born to a man 100 years old? Or can Sarah bear a child at 90? And Abraham said to God, Oh, that Ishmael might live by your favor. God said, Nevertheless, Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. And I will maintain my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring to come. As for Ishmael, I have heeded you. I hereby bless him. I will make him fertile and exceedingly numerous. He shall be the father of 12 chieftains, and I will make of him a great nation. But my covenant I will maintain with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year. And when he is done speaking with him, God was gone from Abraham.
Thank you. And Bill, would you like to read beginning at verse 23?
Sure, thank you. Abraham then took Ishmael his son, and all his homeborn slaves, and those who had been bought, every male among Abraham's slaves. And on that very day, Abraham circumcised the flesh of their foreskins as God had instructed. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day, both Abraham and Ishmael, his son, were were circumcised, and all the people of his household, the homeborn slaves and those bought from foreigners, were circumcised with him.
Thank you. And that's our entire Torah portion for the week. Yashikov, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing in the reading of it. I'd like to share with you a little bit of focused study about the weekly Torah portion, and then I would love to invite everyone to share your own thoughts, reflections, and observations and questions about the Torah portion. When we first started this year's reading of Torah with Bereshit, one of the things that we observed was that it confounded our notion of what a beginning of a great epic is. We thought that we would be opening up a story that would clarify for us where we come from, why we're here, why everything exists. And we noticed that the very first word in the opening of that story undermines the sense of having any kind of clarity. The word Bereshit, we talked about, is a grammatical oddity, and it's not followed by a noun, which is what it should be according to the rules of Hebrew grammar. So it confounded our notion of what was a beginning, the beginning of all of creation. In a sense, this is not a new beginning. This is the beginning of the lineage of the Jewish people. And it occurred to me as we were reading these verses that this too is kind of a confounding beginning, because unlike with the story of Noah opened up and it became clear why Noah was being picked by God for a particular mission, because Noah was righteous among his generation. And here, we don't know why God picks Abraham to begin this great journey and this great enterprise that becomes known as the Jewish people. It just says, God said to Abraham, go forth from your native land, from your father's house. It doesn't say that Abram was also righteous among his generation. It doesn't say that he was particularly wise. It doesn't say that he was particularly generous and therefore God chose. So we're left with some unclarity about why Abram. So we're going to explore that little bit of mystery in the course of this focus study. The other thing that we noticed when we began studying Bereshit was the importance of language, because that is how God brought everything into existence. God said, let there be light, and there was light. God said, let there be a separation of waters above from the waters below, and it was so. So a number of times, everything that gets brought into existence is a result of God's speech. And one of the things that I want to suggest is that this use of the word, God's speech, becomes a way of modeling for us humans about how we are to foster creation, how we are to be partners in creation. And it's by learning how to use speech well. And we encounter in the opening stories that there's a sacred use of speech, and then there's a profane misuse of speech. And just to summarize it in three contrasting ways, a sacred use of speech, based upon how God uses it, is that sacred speech engenders new life. Sacred speech is speech which seeks out to establish relationships with others. Sacred speech is that speech which empowers others to assume responsibility for the sustaining and expansion of creation. By contrast, what we learn from these early stories is that the profane misuse of speech is that speech which destroys life, which divides people, and which weakens others by seeking to take power away from them and impose themselves on others. The importance of speech in all of Torah and learning how to use speech, I think, is beautifully characterized just from a literary point of view by the fact that the main character in the 4 books of Torah after Genesis is Moses. And Moses is a character who's struggling with speech. He's heavy of tongue. And so much of what we read from Exodus all the way through Deuteronomy is Moses himself struggling to learn how to use speech, how to use it in the appropriate moment, how to use it for the appropriate purpose, how to use it in a way that establishes a connection between himself and others. And the book of Deuteronomy, in a sense, is a culmination of his achievement of having realized how to use speech well, because it's one long speech by Moses. So I would like to just take us through a little bit of how there are some examples in the opening chapters of Genesis that tell us a little bit about how important speech is and try to provide us some lessons about it. The first is from the Garden of Eden. If you have a study sheet, you can see there on number 1, this quote, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, so I hid." That's Adam speaking. And here he's using his speech as a way of expressing hiding from responsibility. Poor Adam, poor Eve. They were just babes in the woods, literally. And they were trying to learn how to use speech. Should I use speech to deceive another? Should I use speech to push off responsibility for what I've done onto someone else, which is what Adam seems to do when he tries to pass responsibility off onto Eve. So they don't use speech very well. They use speech as an expression of evading responsibility rather than claiming responsibility. That gets replicated by their son Cain. When Cain kills Abel, and then God says, "Where is your brother?" And Cain says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And so there once again is this profane use of speech to deny a crime that he's committed, to evade responsibility for what he has done, and to perhaps even push it off onto someone else. In fact, there's a lot of midrash that indicates Cain uses his speech to try and turn tables on God's self, and say, "Hey, it's your fault. You saw what was going on. You could have stopped things." So there again, failure in the use of speech. And then in number 3, this is from our last week's study session about Noah, where we observe that Noah was silent from the moment God spoke to him until well after the flood was over. Noah didn't speak once during this entire time, even though God gave Noah several opportunities to respond. When we read the text, it's quite beautiful to see how God said, "Build an ark." And then it's almost as if God waited to have Noah say, "Well, why are you going to do that? What's going to happen?" And God said, "I'm going to destroy everything." And then there's almost like there's a pause in which God is waiting for Noah to say, "You're going to destroy everything?" And then more verses where God is very detailed in the materials and the dimensions of this ark, almost as if piling up all these details, giving Noah the opportunity to intervene at any moment to say, "No, this doesn't seem right. All of humanity can't be bad." Okay. But Noah is silent. He fails in his exercise of using speech. And then we came upon the story of Babel, which is all about the speech in a sense. And that's in number 4 here. Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks. Come, let us build us a city and a tower to make a name for ourselves. Else we shall be scattered all over the world. There, they were using speech as a way to deny what was really God's initial commandment, which was to multiply, be fruitful, expand yourself, go forth, explore. And instead, they're using language as a way to consolidate their own power, to cut themselves off from the rest of the world. So these opening stories are examples of the failure to use speech in a way that God had modeled how to use speech, which was to engender new life, to seek out and create relationships with others, and to empower others to assume greater responsibility for the world around them. So now we get to this week's Torah portion, Abram. Again, we don't know why, at least from the surface words that are in the text, why God chose Abram. So we're going to read a story, a midrash. It's the rabbis are going to use their speech. They're going to use their language to say, we need to dig deeper underneath the words that have been printed on the page to figure out why God chose Abram to embark upon this incredible enterprise that would become known as Judaism. And remember, the rabbis themselves now are also picking up on what had been modeled for them with the very opening of Torah, Bereshit. If you remember, Rashi's comment about Bereshit was, Bereshit, that word only exists to cry out to us saying, expound me, explain me, dig into me, interrogate me, find out for me what I mean. We are called upon to participate in the construction of meaning by not accepting at face value what's placed before us. So the rabbis are now doing that. The rabbis who write this midrash, they say, it's not sufficient just to say, God said to Abraham, go forth. There's something there that needs expounding upon, that needs explication. And so they dig into the story, and this is what they found when they dug deep into the text, and they came up with this story that explains why God picked Abraham. So that's in number 5 in your study sheet. I'll share it with you. Quoting from our Torah portion, God said to Abram, go forth from your native land. Now the midrash. Rabbi Isaac said, this may be compared to one who was traveling from place to place when she saw a building in flames. She wondered, is it possible that the building lacks a person to look after it? The owner of the building looked out and said, I am the owner of the building. Similarly, because Abraham said, is it possible that the world is without a guide? The Holy Blessed One glanced out at him and said, I am the guide, the sovereign of the universe. This midrash is him telling a story that Abraham is wandering about and he sees a palace in flames and says, it's such a beautiful palace. Surely there must be someone around who's responsible for it, who takes care of it, who built it, and who must want it to be protected and have the fire put out. It's in response to that kind of questioning that God then enters Abraham's life. In this midrash, Abraham encounters God not from wondering at the beauty and the awesome harmony and how fantastic everything is and how everything works so well together. No. God comes into Abraham's life once Abraham says, something's not right. The world's in disharmony. The world is burning down. The world is in flames. Surely that's not the way it's supposed to be. Abraham is a character who doesn't accept the way the world is. He knows that there's another possibility. And he knows that there's disorder in the world, and that requires not acceptance, but defiance. It requires intervention. According to the Midrash, in a sense, God responds to that person and in a sense says, you're the one who will carry forth this new mission I have, because you have used your language to interrogate the way the world is, rather than merely accepting the way it is. In great contrast, perhaps, to Noah, who just accepted the world is going to be destroyed. Okay, I'll be saved. Okay. Abraham is disturbed by the violence in the world. Abraham is disturbed that the palace is on fire and seeks to do something about it. So this notion about where did we get that from? We got that from very spare language in our text. God said to Abraham, go forth from your native land. So what the rabbis are teaching us is that language is used in a sacred sense, not to foreclose options, not to foreclose discussion, but is used to open up discussion, to explore the possibilities, to resist the fact that things can just burn up and fall apart. So in number 6, I have a little, just a little way of putting it, which is where there is total revelation, there is no room for language. Where meaning is uncertain, communications proliferate. In that sense, Judaism is an approach to life that doesn't try to present us with all the answers and then ask us to now memorize what all those answers are. Judaism rather, is a way that tries to shape us into beings who know how to ask the questions. And when we ask questions, we have communication. It opens up the dialogue. And the opening up of dialogue, the exploration of new possibilities, is what our text is trying to teach us. This is, number 7 is a quote from Peter Berger, who wrote a book called A Rumor of Angels. It's a very thin book. Maybe it's 100 pages. I don't think so. Maybe probably less than that. And Peter Berger wrote the book because he was observing how in an increasingly secular world, there was this disenchantment that was happening. There was a kind of modernity as a secular society was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with mystery. Always wanted answers, always wanted clarity. And says, it's a sad point to reach when we have no desire for mystery, when we have no desire to be aware of new possibilities and to live with ambiguity. So he has this sentence from his book: the sense of outraged questioning is itself the first confrontation with God. I don't know if he wrote that after reading this week's Torah portion, but that's what's happening. That's what he's describing. Abraham is outraged. What? There's a fire? The house is on fire? What? Someone built it. Someone must care for it. Where's the owner of the house? It shouldn't be like this. And God says, you're right. I'm the owner of the house. Help me put out the fire. And thus begins Abraham's journey. We turn over. The last offering I have in this week's study sheet is from Abraham Joshua Heschel, Man is Not Alone, his book. And he wrote this. He says, religion the end of isolation begins with a consciousness that something is asked of us. Wonder is not a state of aesthetic enjoyment. Endless wonder unlocks an innate sense of indebtedness. Beautiful, just first of all, Rabbi Heschel's notion that what religion ideally seeks to do is to help us end our sense of isolation. The sense that we are not alone. We are not totally, the world does not depend totally on us. We need others. We've explored this in earlier sessions, that sense of needing an other. And that needing an other is something that opens us up to this ethical world where we are each so imperfect that we need others for our own fulfillment. I don't know if anyone was going to bring this up, but as we're reading this week's Torah portion, it jumped out at me, that episode where Abraham and Sarai go down to Egypt and he passes her off as his sister, right? And oh my goodness, what is this? The righteous Abraham, he's passing Sarai off as his sister? What an imperfect guy. That's right. Maybe he smoked cigarettes too, I don't know. There was probably a lot of things about Abraham that were imperfect, but these are the characters that do great things, that produce great art, that produce great adventures, that build great enterprises. They are imperfect. These are imperfect characters, just like us. If they can do that, so can we. Religion, the end of isolation begins with a consciousness that something is asked of us. Wonder is not a state of aesthetic enjoyment. Abraham doesn't go, oh, everything is so beautiful. No, endless wonder unlocks an innate sense of indebtedness. Something is asked of me, and I am grateful for being asked. I hope I measure up to it. So with that, I'd like to invite others to share your thoughts, your comments, your reflections about this journey that we've been on through Lecha. Yes, Mark, go ahead and unmute yourself and share what your thoughts are.
Okay, I'm live now, right?
Yes.
I think you mentioned in the past that in order to have speech that is sacred and responsible, that speech has to open up the possibility of discussion. And I don't know why I was thinking of the prophets, and I was wondering whether we could consider the prophets to fulfill that requirement. Because oftentimes I think the prophets spoke the truth, but maybe by that definition it wasn't sacred because they were very divisive, many of them, in the way that they spoke. So I was wondering how you might answer that question and get the views of other people.
Yeah, sometimes I guess there's good division and bad division, right? There is the speaking of truth, which draws a line and then challenges us to measure up to it. There's other division in which, but the hope there of the person who's speaking is that people will then unite internally on a moral basis, and then will unite as a nation in doing the right thing. Then there's division, there's speaking that is eager for only separation, because that way that person gets to hold on to power. That may be, when we get to the story of Korah, that may be what was behind his speaking. He was hoping for dividing people so that he could rise to power, which is not what the prophets were seeking to do, right? They were seeking to have the people become aware of their shortcomings and their failures and to measure up. Thanks for the question. It's a really good question. Thanks. Yeah, David.
Yeah, I'm looking at your art.
Yes.
It's the House of Parliament burning,
Yes.
which is in a way a palace on steroids. And then I'm jumping to sort of the core, as far as I can tell, of the trajectory of your teaching, that there's a midrash that Rabbi Isaac says, and we're going to think of this as if it were Abraham, that a person was walking, saw a building in flames, and went, whoa, there must be an owner, what's going on there? And then Abraham says it's possible that the world's without a guide, and the Holy One glanced out and said, I'm the guide, the sovereign of the universe. I have a disconnect of upon what Rabbi Isaac was standing in this text, or in the story of Abraham overall, that caused him to jump to this somewhat famous allegory about God in the burning building. Was there something about the story of Abraham that makes you think, here's someone that's seeing the world on fire? And if so, I need to connect with that more strongly.
Well, we will see this further in next week's Torah portion, when God says, Sodom and Gomorrah, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And maybe God is waiting to see, are you going to be like Noah and say, okay, go ahead, or say nothing at all? Or are you going to intervene and interrogate me, challenge me? Just like, and so maybe that's where Rabbi Isaac kind of leads back into the earlier portion of Abraham's story and says, he acted that way about Sodom and Gomorrah. So maybe God saw this, experienced that earlier, but it just didn't get written down in the black letters of the story. Okay, so that's what he encountered. Richard, yeah.
Yes, in this regard, in getting ready for tonight, I looked back at some old notes from 11/5/2011. Every day is a new crossroads. And these lines I wrote: why did God pick Abram? Was it random? Could it have been any one of us? Maybe a better question is, what led Abram to listen for a voice there at the crossroads, where his father died, having brought the people up from Ur? What am I going to do now? Well, if it was me, I'd impute a God to heaven, so I wouldn't feel so all alone with all these folks counting on me. Conscience seems to dictate faith. We'd figure it out together.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. Beautiful story. Wayne?
Yeah, first, Richard, that was beautiful. Wow. I have a basic question and then a comment. The first one is, what was the reasoning for God to change Avram and Sarai's name?
Thank you for asking that. I was wondering that. Yeah.
Why?
Well, the changing of a name in many cultures, and certainly within Judaism, indicates a new status or a change of one's life position. And so there's a notion that here what's happening is they are now transitioning from being just mere nomads to now being the establishers of a whole new line. And so they have the letter Hey, which is represents a house, if you will. It represents the shape of the letter Hey is like a house that you go in, and so they're now establishing the house of Abraham and Sarah.
And then the comment I had was the leap of faith that happened throughout the Torah, of course. But for grown men, for a 99-year-old man to agree to personally cut off the tip of his penis, has always struck me as being an odd way to demonstrate loyalty or obedience to God. I would think there would have been many other things I would have put down on a piece of paper before I decided to take a knife to my manhood, but so be it. I've always thought that was an odd way to demonstrate loyalty to God.
So if you remember in the story, what happens is there's this ritual where these animals are taken and then they are slaughtered, and then there is one animal that is cut in half, and then that image of the torch going between the two halves. So what our scholars tell us is that oftentimes in ancient society, the way that a treaty between two sovereigns was solemnized was just that, to sacrifice an animal, cut it in half, and have the two participants walk in between the two halves. So that notion of incising, cutting, was a way of formalizing a pact between two sovereigns. So maybe that's part of what's happening here with the man incising and cutting the flesh of his penis is a way of replicating that ritualized way of formalizing a pact between two sovereigns.
The creating of the relationship with God. Your penis creates, right? I mean, you look at your children. It's a close connection. Well, I wanted to say about the burning house, the burning palace, whatever is the building that's burning. God says it is possible the world, is it possible the world is without a guide? And the Holy One glanced out at Abraham and said, I'm the guide, the sovereign of the universe. I'm just thinking that burning house, which looks wrong to us, it looks like, oh my, what is happening? It's getting destroyed. Maybe that's just another essence of reality. It's another paradigm. It just shifts up. Maybe everything is a burning, and it's just a new way of looking at things.
Okay.
Maybe that's the norm, not the abnormality.
Yeah, I guess.
Yihi or, the first thing, let there be light. What's more bright than a burning building at night? And by the way, this beautiful picture by J.M.W. Turner, the burning houses of Parliament, that's on the top of the study sheet. I was sitting in our living room looking at the picture that Norman Gorbati created for Rabbi Moskowitz, and the colors are the same. The Torah is living and swirling. It's something the same. The colors are just the same as the burning houses.
So just thank you. A word about the painting by the great English painter Turner. This is the burning of the Houses of Parliament, which happened in 1834. And at least the story is that when the House of Lords and the House of Commons both caught on fire on that day in 1834, the story is that Turner ran out into the streets and saw them. And his way of commemorating this horrific moment was to paint a beautiful work of art. So this is just now crossing through my mind, the notion of taking tragedy, and instead of just merely observing it or accepting it, somehow taking that tragedy and turning it into something beautiful.
That's what I was talking about.
Yeah. So perhaps that's a challenge for all of us, which is, and Anna's right, maybe things are always burning everywhere or somewhere. And the question is, are we aware of that? Do we see it? Do we see
and when we see it, we create the water that gets out the fire.
Do we see what's on fire? Do we see the damage? Do we see things breaking? And if we do we just shrug our shoulders and say, that's the way of the world, or nothing I can do about it? Or do we somehow engage ourselves in a way as to create something beautiful as a result?
We can create verbally something beautiful verbally as well, and that relates to tonight's study.
Yeah, there are to use one's language. That seems to be the primary way that Judaism understands things are healed and brought forward, is to use our language well. And of course, there are many other tools that we as human artists have
Lamentations.
to create beauty. I think Jackie or Tom, did you have something you want? Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, with these sacred words, and some of them I assume are written down, as we were reading this evening, and all the evenings we read, I have the URJ's Torah. Jackie has the women's commentary, and I don't know what everybody else, but they're all different. They're all different. And I read a book, it's called Scribal Culture and the Making of the Hebrew Bible. And the point he makes is these guys are sitting down there scribing all day, back in the days of Caesar. And one guy says, well, that word, I think I could spice that up a little. It just doesn't sound right. And years and years and generations. And my question is this these glacial changes that happen, is this a good thing? Or could it be not such a good thing? With people 100 years from now, I don't recognize, that just doesn't sound like the Bible, the Torah that I read. This is totally different, instead of neat is cool or groovy, same meaning, but anyway.
So that's the glory, I think, of the Jewish approach to all this, which is that these words, at least the Hebrew words, stay the same. They're the same words they've been for over 2,000 years. And yet somehow they also keep finding new nuance because of our reading them. So Judaism is an interpretive religion, not a doctrinal religion. It is a religion that says you are essential in the creation of meaning. Meaning is not presented to you as a done deal, and it remains that way for over hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. You are required to participate in the creation of meaning. And that has engendered a people that's not just creative readers. We are creative human beings in all aspects of life because we have culturally been taught we're needed. We have something to offer. In fact, it's essential that we be innovative and creative. It's a great heritage.
But what he's saying is even back when things were being scribed in Aramaic or Hebrew, there was no Xerox copy. So they were made by human beings and they changed things. They missed things, they misspelled. And this may be what we've come up with, but what was the original? What was the original 2,000 years ago?
Well, good. Next time you go to Israel, go to the Israel Museum and you can see the Dead Sea Scrolls. That goes pretty far back.
But that's not as far back as it goes, Tom.
Thank you, Anna. That's right.
And if you think that every human being has the power, whenever we read Torah, every word of it, we can change a letter, we can add a yud, we can subtract a vav. All the time we study Torah, we change the words slightly to magnify the meanings that might be potentially lying there. We all change the Torah. It's not just a scribe changed one letter of one word and that changed the meaning. We all change the meaning of creation by how we write and speak our lives to each other and ourselves.
Susan and Richard.
So I was struck with, first of all, this Torah portion involves two women pretty actively. Frequently, we don't get that in the Torah. And when Hagar runs away, God gives her a well. And I was struck by the fact that women are how we procreate, and throughout the Torah, they're frequently associated with water.
Oh, I think you just gave a nice segue for Richard there. Go ahead.
Well, about that, of course, when the waters dry up is when Miriam dies and they have problems because the spirit isn't there. If the women aren't around the table, they don't just fight, they try and, create conversation. But I want to say about all the different words for everything. I've got my grandfather's Bible. I got one I got from Beth Israel when I was a kid. I got another one from somewhere else, and they're all very different. And we all read from different ones, and I hear it. But I think the beauty of that is it adds something to my understanding each time.
Yeah.
And we're not bound to, as you say, Rabbi, some authoritarian, this is the way it really is. There is no really. We're constantly creating, and we're always getting more nuance and more balance of whether it's a restrictive way to look at this or whether it's an expansive way to look at it. How do we look at it balanced? And we share that, and we all grow in our understandings out of hearing one another use these different words in different accounts. I think it's wonderful stuff.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to draw to a conclusion by inviting Bill. You have a song you'd like to share with us, is that right?
I do. There's this portion in particular. It goes, there's something about Lecha that's got me thinking about Eddie Van Halen, something about that, like that young leaving your father's house. So I had to break up the electric here. So anyway. I will bless you. I will bless you. I will bless you, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless you. I will bless you. I will bless you, and you shall be a blessing. Go, move forward in the future. Go, move in a world turned upside down. Go, move forward in the future. Go, move into Israel. I will bless you. I will bless you. I will bless you, and you shall be a blessing.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, each and every one of you, for your beautiful writing, your beautiful participation, your beautiful presence. I look forward to continuing the journey with you next week. God bless you all. Be well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Shabbat
Thank
shalom.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Night.
Night, everyone.